Blind Seamstress was mending clothes for pennies until a mysterious customer paid in gold and asked. The needle found its way through fabric like a fish through dark water, guided not by sight, but by 20 years of memory living in Rosemary's fingertips. She sat in the corner of Morrison's general store, back to the wall, face turned toward the window she couldn't see but could feel, warmth on her skin telling her the angle of the sun, the time of day, the season's progression. 3 shirts today, 2 pairs of trousers, a child's dress with a torn hem. Each piece told its story through texture and weight, through the placement of wear and the quality of thread. Pennies per piece, sometimes a nickel for complicated work. Enough to keep her corner in the boarding house. Enough for bread and soup. Never enough for the dreams that still visited her in the darkness that had been her world for 5 years now. The accident had taken her sight on a Tuesday in September. She remembered that detail with peculiar clarity. Tuesday because she'd been working on Mrs. Henderson's wedding dress, the one with pearl buttons and Italian lace. The lamp oil had spilled, the flame had jumped, and in her haste to save the dress she'd turned wrong, caught the full flash of burning oil across her face. The dress survived. Her eyes did not. Tuesday had become the dividing line of her life. Before, when she'd been the most sought-after seamstress in 3 counties, and after, when she became the blind woman in the corner, doing mending for pennies because no one trusted her with fine work anymore. The bell above the door chimed, and Rosemary's hands didn't pause in their work. She'd learned to identify customers by their footsteps, their breathing, the way they moved through space. Mrs. Patterson's shuffling gait, young Tom Morrison's eager bounce, Sheriff Williams's heavy, deliberate tread. But these footsteps were unfamiliar, measured, careful, with a slight unevenness that suggested an old injury. Male, from the weight. Well-dressed, from the quality of the boot leather. A stranger, then. Travellers rarely needed mending done, preferring to push on to larger towns where the work would be faster. But the footsteps approached her corner, stopped at a respectful distance. "Good afternoon," the voice said, and Rosemary's needle paused for just a moment. The voice was cultured, Eastern-educated maybe, with an undertone of something else, fatigue perhaps, or a sadness worn so long it had become part of the vocal cords themselves. "Good afternoon," she replied, resuming her stitching. "If you've got mending, leave it in the basket. Mr. Morrison will tell you when it's ready. Usually 3 days for simple work, a week for anything complex." "I have something unusual," the man said. "A coat that requires particular care. It's quite old, quite valuable to me. I'm told you're the best seamstress in town." Rosemary almost smiled. "Was," she corrected. "Was the best. Now I do mending. Simple work. Nothing that requires—" She gestured vaguely at her face, at the scars she knew were there, though she'd never seen them. "I believe you're still the best," the stranger said quietly. "Blindness doesn't take skill from the fingers. It often sharpens it. Other senses compensate. You know fabric better now than when you could see it, don't you? Feel things that eyes might miss." Rosemary's hands stilled completely. No one had ever suggested her blindness might be anything but loss. "Please," the man continued, "at least look at it, or rather examine it. Tell me if it can be saved." There was rustling, and then weight settled across her lap. Rosemary set aside her current work, let her fingers explore this new puzzle. The coat was wool, but finer than any she'd felt. The weave was tight, complex. Speaking of looms she'd only heard about in stories of European mills, age lived in the fibers, decades of wear carefully maintained. And damage. Oh, such strange damage. 3 tears, each precise as surgery. Here near the heart, here along the ribs, here at the shoulder. Not random rips, but deliberate cuts, as if someone had known exactly where to strike. The edges were clean, speaking of sharp steel rather than accident. Around each tear the fabric held other stories. Stiffness that might be old blood, carefully cleaned but never quite erased. Powder burns near the cuffs. The particular wear pattern of a holster at the hip, though she sensed this man no longer carried guns. Her fingers found the interior, silk lining smooth as water, monogrammed with letters she could trace but not read. Quality beyond anything that had passed through her hands, before or after the darkness came. "This can be mended," she said slowly, "but not invisible. Scars will remain." "Sometimes," the man said, "scars are important. They remind us of what we've survived." "How much?" she asked, already calculating the hours this would take, the careful work needed to honor such a garment. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you charge for a simple shirt?" 3 cents, she replied. He reached into his pocket, and she heard the distinctive clink of gold, not silver. "Then I'll pay 100 times that for this coat. $3 in gold, in advance. And if the work pleases me, the same again when it's complete. Rosemary's breath caught. $6 gold was more than she made in 3 months. It was impossible, excessive, suspicious. Why? She asked. Why so much for simple mending? Because it's not simple, the man replied. Because this coat has traveled from Boston to San Francisco, through war and peace, through choices I'm not proud of and ones that saved my life. Because the woman who made it has been dead for 15 years, and you're the first person I've trusted to touch it since she passed. Because I believe craftsmanship should be valued, whether the craftsman can see or not. And because... His voice dropped, became almost whisper, because I know what it's like to lose everything and have to rebuild from fragments. The gold coins were placed gently on her work table, their weight undeniable. Rosemary touched them, these perfect circles of possibility. When do you need it? She asked. I'll be in town a week, the stranger said. Take your time. Do it right. I'm staying at the Riverside Inn, room 12. The name is Gabriel Hart. After he left, Rosemary sat for a long time with the coat across her lap, fingers reading its history like Braille. Gabriel Hart. The name meant nothing to her, but the coat spoke volumes. This was a man who'd lived multiple lives, carried violence, and tried to leave it behind, valued beauty enough to preserve it through whatever had caused those precise wounds. She began that evening, after the shop closed, and her corner grew quiet. Touch told her what eyes never could have, the exact tension needed to match the original weave, the way the fabric wanted to lie, the places where strength mattered more than beauty. She worked by feel and instinct, each stitch a prayer to the craft she'd thought lost. The work consumed her in ways mending never had. This wasn't just fixing, it was restoration, resurrection, a conversation with the original maker across years and miles. She found herself humming as she worked, old songs her mother had taught her, melodies that seemed to guide the needle's path. By the 3rd day, word had somehow spread. Mrs. Morrison mentioned customers asking about the blind seamstress working on something special. Even Mr. Morrison, usually concerned only with ledgers and profits, paused by her corner to ask if she needed anything. Better thread, perhaps? A more comfortable chair. The attention made her nervous, but the work itself was too absorbing to let anxiety intrude. On the 4th evening, as she worked on the final tier, the one near the heart, the most delicate, she heard familiar, unfamiliar footsteps. Gabriel Hart had returned earlier than expected. May I sit? He asked, and she nodded toward the chair she knew was nearby. He settled with a slight grunt that confirmed her suspicion about old injuries. You work in the dark, he observed. Don't need light when you can't use it, she replied, not pausing in her stitching. Saves Mr. Morrison oil money. Practical, he said, but also somewhat poetic. A craftsman working by touch alone, guided by skill rather than sight. She snorted softly. Pretty words don't change reality, Mr. Hart. I'm a blind woman doing work machines will soon do better. Just trying to last as long as I can. What if you could do more than last? He asked. What if you could thrive? Rosemary's needle paused. Careful, Mr. Hart. Hope is expensive for people like me. I traffic in reality. Thread and fabric and pennies. Dreams are for people who can afford them. He was quiet for a moment. Then, tell me about before. When you could see. What did you make then? The question surprised her into honesty. Everything, she said softly. Ball gowns that moved like water. Wedding dresses that made plain girls beautiful. Suits that turned farmers into gentlemen for a day. I once made a coat for the governor's wife. Took 3 months. Every stitch perfect. She wore it to meet the president. Said it was the finest thing she'd ever owned. And now? Gabriel prompted gently. Now I fix holes, she said, bitterness creeping in despite her efforts. Now I'm the warning mothers give their daughters about working too close to lamps. Now I'm grateful for 3 cents and a corner to work in. But your hands remember, he said. Your hands know beauty still. This coat proves it. I've watched you work, forgive me, I've been coming by when you didn't know. The way you touch fabric, the way you understand it. You don't need eyes for that. You never did. The eyes just confirmed what your fingers already knew. She felt tears threaten, pushed them back. Blind women who cry get no sympathy, only pity, and pity didn't pay rent. I have a proposition, Gabriel said. I own a building in San Francisco. 3 stories, good light. Not that you need it, but your workers would. The first floor would be perfect for a shop. A real shop, not a corner in someone else's store. The conditions there, they're different. People care more about quality than convention. A blind seamstress who creates by touch alone, that would be a draw, not a deterrent. You could teach others, build something lasting. Rosemary laughed, short and sharp. And how would a blind woman run a shop? How would I manage accounts, handle customers, navigate a city I've never seen? Details, Gabriel said dismissively. Solvable problems. You'd have help, of course. I know people who owe me favors, good people looking for fresh starts. Some of them have their own challenges. A man who lost his voice in the war but keeps excellent books. A woman with a twisted foot who has an eye for color and fabric. We could build something new. A place where different doesn't mean less. The coat was nearly finished. Just a few more stitches to secure the heart wound properly. Rosemary worked in silence, mind racing. It was impossible, of course. Leave Morrison Falls, where she knew every street by count of steps. Trust a stranger with gold coins and a mysterious past. Build a business on the radical notion that blindness hadn't stolen her gift, only changed how she accessed it. Madness. But her fingers on the coat told a different story. This was the best work she'd done since the accident, maybe the best work she'd ever done, because she'd had to trust entirely in touch, in instinct, in the conversation between thread and fabric that eyes sometimes interrupted with their opinions about how things should look. Why? She asked finally. Why does it matter to you whether a blind seamstress in Morrison Falls thrives or just survives? Gabriel was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. Then, because I had a daughter, she was born different. Her mind worked in ways others couldn't understand. Brilliant with numbers but couldn't speak properly. People called her simple, defective. I was away, building my fortune, believing success mattered more than presence. Her mother died when she was 12. The relatives I left her with, they were ashamed, put her in an asylum. By the time I'd made enough money to matter, she was gone. Fever, they said. But I know the truth. She died of being different in a world that fears difference. His voice was steady, but Rosemary heard the fault lines in it, the places where grief had cracked and healed and cracked again. So now I look for others the world calls broken. I offer them chances to prove the world wrong. Not charity. I'm not that good a man. Investment. Because I've learned that the people society discards are often the ones with the most to offer. They just need someone to see it. Or in your case, to understand that seeing isn't always about eyes. Rosemary tied off the final stitch, ran her fingers over the mended coat one last time. The scars were there, as she'd promised, but they added to, rather than detracted from the garment's story. This was a coat that had lived, suffered, survived. Like its owner, like her. If I say yes, she said slowly, what happens next? Gabriel stood, and she heard him putting on the coat, the whisper of wool settling into place. First, we get you out of this corner, find you rooms at the riverside while we make arrangements. Then we travel to San Francisco, first class, because if we're going to change how the world sees you, we start by changing how you see yourself. We find the building, hire the help, spread the word. I have connections in the fashion world there, people who value innovation over convention. We start small but aim large. And if I fail, she asked, if it turns out a blind seamstress is just a novelty that wears off, then you come back here to your corner. No worse than before but for having tried. But you won't fail. How can you be so sure? Because you've already succeeded. You've been doing impossible things in this corner for 5 years. Now you'll just do them somewhere that appreciates impossibility. Rosemary made her decision in the space between heartbeats. Yes, she said. Yes, but with conditions. I choose the workers. I train them my way. We take anyone willing to learn, regardless of their challenges, and we charge what the work is worth, not what charity dictates. Gabriel extended his hand, and she found it, shook it firmly. Agreed. Partnership, not charity. Building something new from the pieces others overlook. He placed something in her other hand, not coins this time, but a key. For the shop, he said. So you know it's real. The key was heavy, brass worn smooth by other hands. Rosemary closed her fingers around it. This tangible promise of a different future. When do we leave? Tuesday, Gabriel said, and she almost smiled. Tuesday, of course. The day that had ended, one life, would begin another. The week that followed passed in a blur of preparations. Mr. Morrison, shocked at losing his most reliable worker, tried to convince her to stay with offers of better percentage, a chair by the window, even a small raise in her piece rate. But Rosemary's mind was already in San Francisco, imagining rooms full of fabric she could navigate by touch, workers who understood that different didn't mean less capable, customers who valued skill over conventional expectations. She packed her few belongings, said goodbye to the boarding house that had been her world since the accident, and tried not to think too hard about the enormity of what she was doing. Gabriel proved as good as his word. The train tickets were indeed first class, and he'd arranged for assistance at every station. But more than that, he'd thought of details she hadn't. A travelling companion, Mrs. Chen, who'd worked as a lady's maid and could help navigate unfamiliar spaces without making Rosemary feel helpless. Descriptions of the journey recorded in advance, so she could picture what she couldn't see. Even a selection of fabrics to work with during the long journey, because he understood that idle hands would make her anxious. As the train pulled away from Morrison Falls, Rosemary pressed her face to the window she couldn't see through, saying goodbye to the town that had been both shelter and prison. San Francisco assaulted her senses in ways Morrison Falls never had. The noise of carriages and cable cars, the scent of ocean mixing with city smoke, the voices in a dozen languages calling their wares and their gossip. But Gabriel and Mrs. Chen guided her through it all, and by the third day she was beginning to map this new world in her mind. The shop was everything he'd promised. She could feel the quality of the space in the way sound moved through it, the solidity of the floors, the height of the ceilings. The first floor was indeed perfect for a showroom, with what Mrs. Chen described as beautiful natural light from tall windows. The second floor could be workshop space. The third, living quarters for workers who needed them. Within a month, Hart & Associates Fine Tailoring was born. The associates were as unusual as Gabriel had promised. Marcus, the mute bookkeeper, whose mathematical brilliance showed in perfectly balanced ledgers. Sarah, whose twisted foot didn't stop her from having the best color sense in the city. Chen Lu, whose missing fingers from a factory accident hadn't diminished his ability to cut patterns with precision. Each brought their own challenges and compensations, creating a workplace where difference was normal and adaptation constant. Rosemary trained them all in her methods. Trust the fabric, let touch guide where sight might mislead, understand that perfection came from patience rather than hurry. The first customers came from curiosity, Gabriel's connections wanting to see this blind seamstress he'd been promoting, but they returned for the quality. Rosemary's hands, freed from the shame Morrison Falls had wrapped around them, created wonders. A wedding dress that seemed to float rather than hang. A gentleman's coat that transformed posture into presence. Children's clothes that allowed for play while maintaining elegance. Each piece was touched by her hands at some point, her fingers the final judge of whether it met the shop's standards. Word spread through San Francisco's fashion-conscious elite. If you wanted something truly special, you went to the blind seamstress who saw with her fingers. But the real revolution came from the teaching. Other blind women, hearing of the shop, came seeking work. Women with tremors, with missing fingers, with bodies that didn't match society's expectations of what a seamstress should be. Rosemary trained them all, developing techniques that worked with, rather than against, their limitations. Touch-based pattern making, texture coding for color matching, team approaches where different abilities combined to create wholes greater than their parts. Within 2 years, Hart & Associates had become known not just for quality, but for innovation, introducing methods that traditional shops began to quietly adopt. The partnership with Gabriel evolved beyond business. He'd stop by the shop daily when in town, and they'd developed a friendship built on shared understanding of how loss could transform into something else if given the chance. He never spoke more of his daughter, but Rosemary felt her presence in his fierce protection of the workers, his insistence on fair wages and good conditions, his joy when someone deemed unemployable elsewhere thrived in their environment. Sometimes, working late in the shop with the sounds of the city settling into evening, Rosemary would touch the mended coat that Gabriel still wore and remember that first meeting, the mysterious customer with gold coins and an impossible proposition. 5 years in, the shop had expanded to the building next door. 10 seamstresses and tailors worked there now, plus support staff, plus the apprentices who came to learn methods that no traditional shop taught. The client list read like a who's who of California society, but Rosemary was most proud of the other list, the workers who'd gone on to open their own shops, spreading the philosophy that difference was asset rather than liability. Sarah had married and moved to Sacramento, where she ran a shop specializing in adaptive clothing for people with physical differences. Chen Lu had saved enough to bring his family from China and now operated a small empire of tailoring shops that employed other immigrants. The letter came on a Tuesday, always Tuesday, in her 7th year in San Francisco. Morrison Falls had heard of her success, the town council wrote. Would she consider returning to open a branch of her shop there? They'd provide the building, support her methods, welcome her back, as the success story she'd become. Rosemary had Mrs. Chen read the letter twice, then dictated her response. She was grateful for the offer but must decline. San Francisco was home now. However, she would be happy to train someone from Morrison Falls in her methods, if they were willing to send candidates who understood that blindness, deafness, lameness, or any other difference didn't disqualify someone from creating beauty. The shop's 10th anniversary celebration filled both buildings with clients, workers past and present, and curious newcomers drawn by the story of the blind seamstress who'd revolutionized West Coast fashion. Gabriel, grayer now but still straight-backed in his perfectly mended coat, gave a toast that brought tears to eyes that could see, and those that couldn't. To vision beyond sight, he said, to finding gold in what others discard, to the courage of reaching for impossible things and the grace of catching them. Rosemary, in a gown she'd made by touch alone, silk that whispered, lace that sang, embroidery that told stories in texture, raised her own glass. To Tuesday, she said, and those who knew the story understood. But the real celebration came after the guests left, when the workers gathered in the workshop for their own party. These people who'd been told they were too broken to be useful, creating beauty with hands that shook or eyes that couldn't see or voices that couldn't speak. Marcus wrote jokes on his slate that had them all laughing. The newest apprentice, a girl born without her left hand, showed off the specialized tools Rosemary had developed for her. Stories were shared of customers who'd come in skeptical and left believers, of techniques invented from necessity that had become industry standard, of lives transformed by the radical notion that everyone had something to offer. As the evening wound down, Rosemary found herself in her favorite spot, the corner of the main workshop where she'd first set up her station. Not hidden away like in Morrison Falls, but centered, a place of honor from which she could hear everything, guide everything, touch every piece that needed her approval. Gabriel found her there, settling into the chair beside her with the comfortable silence of old friendship. "We did it," he said simply. "We actually did it." "No," Rosemary corrected, fingers running over a piece of silk that would become someone's dream tomorrow. "We're doing it, present tense. Because it's never finished, is it? There's always another person being told they can't, another talent being wasted because it doesn't fit the mold." Gabriel was quiet for a moment. "She's been gone 25 years now. My daughter. Sometimes I still dream of her grown up working here. She would have loved you, you know, would have loved all of this." "She is working here," Rosemary said softly. "In every chance you give, every person you see, truly. That's how the lost ones stay with us, in what we build from the ruins they leave behind." She reached over, found his hand, squeezed it. "Thank you for seeing what I couldn't see in myself, for the gold coins and the impossible proposition for Tuesday." Gabriel squeezed back. "Thank you for saying yes, for proving that the world's definitions of broken are just failures of imagination, for showing me that my daughter's differences might have been gifts if the world had been ready to receive them." They sat in comfortable silence as the shop settled around them, fabric whispering secrets in the evening breeze through windows opened to let the day's work breathe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new clients, new workers seeking a place where different was normal and normal was negotiable. But tonight, Rosemary was content to sit in her corner, not the corner of shame and pennies, but the corner of possibility and purpose. Her fingers found a piece of fabric, began absently exploring its texture, already imagining what it might become, because that was the real magic. Not that a blind woman could sew, but that she could see possibilities in cloth and people that sighted eyes might miss. The needle would find its way through fabric tomorrow as it had today, as it had for all the years since a mysterious customer paid in gold and asked. But now it carved not just thread through cloth, but paths through prejudice, showing the world that broken was just another word for beautiful, if you knew how to look. Or in Rosemary's case, how to touch, how to trust, how to transform Tuesday from an ending into a beginning, over and over again, stitch by precious stitch.